They were 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, close enough that a man with good eyes could pick out the silhouette of onion domes against the winter sky. Imagine cold so sharp it seems to bite through leather and lead. Imagine breath fogging in front of a soldier's face, boots sinking into ice-crusted snow, rifles slick with frost. For the German infantry there, victory felt almost within reach. Moscow visible on the horizon, the symbolic heart of Soviet power apparently trembling. Yet they stopped. The image of frozen men on the outskirts of the Soviet capital has become shorthand for why Hitler failed in the East. The Russian winter, as if it were an enemy in its own right. But what if the winter were only the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem? Before we chase hypotheticals, set the rules for this thought experiment. Keep the same leaders. Hitler remains the decision-maker, Stalin still in the Kremlin. Keep the Barbarossa timetable. The invasion starts when it did. Now change 3 choices. Germany does not prosecute a prolonged air campaign against Britain, and does not commit major ground forces to North Africa. And crucially, Germany never declares war on the United States. That's the core divergence. No Channel campaign bleeding men and equipment. No Rommel drawing off elite resources in the sands. No immediate transatlantic mobilization against the Reich. What does Germany gain, in practical material terms? And would those gains have made the weather irrelevant, or still secondary to something else? If you like history that digs into economics and supply as well as battlefield drama, hit subscribe. This is where those threads meet. Now imagine the balance sheet. The gains are not romantic. They are cold accounting. Pulling out of the fight with Britain and avoiding North Africa would free up roughly 20 to 30% more effective combat power for the Eastern campaign. Translated into machines and men, that's on the order of nearly 2,000 additional aircraft able to operate over the Soviet front, and an extra 3 to 4 fully equipped mechanized or panzer divisions, formations with tanks, mobile infantry, artillery, and the electrical logistics that make maneuver war possible. Beyond units and planes, the Reich would save thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition that, in our reality, were burned against the RAF, squandered across the Mediterranean, or hoarded against an eventual showdown with America. Numbers change the story here. Air superiority over the front is not just prestige, it is a multiplier. With roughly 1,900 more aircraft available, Germany's ability to escort supply convoys, interdict Soviet reinforcements, and ground attack columns of troops transiting the vast Russian interior would rise markedly. 3 to 4 fresh mechanized divisions would change operational geometry. They give an attacker more punch at decisive points, more depth on breakthroughs, and more capacity to exploit fleeting opportunities before winter set in. In short, the Wehrmacht in this counterfactual would present a qualitatively different threat at the end of 1941 than the actual force that thinned and stalled outside Moscow. So what happens on the battlefield? With these additional forces applied judiciously, several immediate operational effects become plausible. The German summer offensive of 1941 reaches Moscow not only on a psychological wavelength, but with enough concentrated force to overwhelm the defense rings before they can properly reorganize. In late 1941, in our scenario, Moscow falls. Leningrad's siege accelerates. Without the need to divert resources to seal the Baltic Islands or keep supply lines open to Britain, German formations can tighten the ring and take the city outright in early 1942. And then, with the logistical gulf narrowed by avoided deployments elsewhere, a focused 1942 campaign for the Caucasus, the oil of Baku in particular, becomes attainable. Baku's output, on the order of tens of millions of tons a year, fed the Soviet war machine. Controlling those fields would strike at the fuel lifeblood of Red Army mechanization. Capture of the Caucasus and Baku would be more than symbolic. It would deprive the Soviets of critical petroleum supplies, potentially forcing them to ration fuel, reduce armored operations, and disrupt industrial transport. At the operational level, the Wehrmacht, with added aircraft and mechanized forces, could impose temporary paralysis on the Soviet ability to contest large-scale territorial losses. Those territorial gains would reshape the map and give Germany leverage. Control of Western Russia, the grain-producing South, and the oil fields would not only bolster the Reich's immediate resources, but also present Berlin with bargaining chips for any negotiated settlement. Yet this is where the visible drama of the battlefield, columns moving through snow, frozen soldiers, seized capitals, collides with the invisible gears of war, industry, transport, and the capacity to turn production into fighting power. For every factory a German tank crew captures, 100 factors decide whether the Red Army can replace that tank, maintain its lines, or build a new chassis behind the front. And the Soviet response to Germany's onrush was not passive. From 1941 into 1942, the Soviet state undertook an astonishing relocation of industrial capacity east of the Urals. Over 1,500 factories, 1,523 by the best counts, were picked up, dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved out of reach of German bombers and ground armies. More than 10 million people were evacuated as part of this effort. Engineers, technicians, workers, their families, whole industrial communities transferred thousands of kilometers to the east. Factories were transplanted like entire cities, to use an image that is accurate without being melodramatic. This was not improvisation alone. It was organized, brutal, and massive. And then production surged. The numbers for 1942 are stark. Soviet tank production that year reached roughly 24,500 units, compared to about 9,300 German tanks. Aircraft output also tipped in favor of the Soviets, around 25,400 compared to approximately 15,400 for Germany. On pure output, the Soviet Union in 1942 was producing more of the metal that mattered for the battlefield. Quantities, however, are not identical to combat power. A tank sitting in a factory warehouse is not the same as a tank with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, trained crews, and a route onto the battlefield. This is the invisible battlefield, logistics. Production without reliable transport is a hollow victory. The Soviet Union's industrial heart beat in the Urals, West Siberia, and beyond, far from the front. The real question became not whether the Soviets could make machines, but whether they could move them and sustain them across the tens or hundreds of kilometers that separated factories from the front lines. Railroads, trucks, fuel depots, and repair facilities are the circulatory system of any large-scale war. And here, American aid, Lend-Lease, emerges as the decisive mechanism that connects Soviet production to Soviet victory. Lend-Lease was not a handout of glamourary the way headlines sometimes suggest. It was practical, mechanical, and enormous. Nearly 430,000 trucks, roughly 427,284, were shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. About 14,000 aircraft were delivered. Millions of tons of food, on the order of 4.5 million tons, kept cities and labor forces alive through starvation-level strains. Locomotives, rail cars, machine tools, and petroleum shipments crossed vast oceans and rivers. These imports plugged critical gaps. They provided mobile transport where Soviet industry had been starved for road vehicles. They supplied aviation types that could be deployed while domestic production ramped up. They provided parts and industrial equipment that kept factories running. Why did trucks matter so much? Because on the Eastern Front, the railway network tangled the strategic picture. Rail could move tons of iron far more efficiently than road, but it required compatibility, available locomotives, and intact lines. And everything had to feed from an eastern production base to western battlefields. Rail gauges differed across borders, and damage to rails, bridges, and rolling stock from bombing and sabotage repeatedly reduced throughput. Trucks, on the other hand, offered the mobility that lines of rail could not, especially when railheads were destroyed or overloaded. The thousands of Lend-Lease trucks carried ammunition, fuel, mobile artillery, engineers, and replacement parts. They enabled offensives by hauling the essentials that tanks and mechanized formations consume at an astonishing rate. Without those trucks, Soviet formations would have faced crippling shortages of fuel and munitions at the moment they attempted to convert industrial output into operational thrusts. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself acknowledged the importance of Allied aid. Paraphrasing his wartime assessments, he credited supplied vehicles, aircraft, and materiel with making large-scale Soviet offensives feasible. Zhukov's practical experience, directing counteroffensives, orchestrating defenses, and managing logistics in the field, is evidence that the Red Army's operational choices were shaped not only by doctrine and bravery, but by whether it could be supplied. When asked about the sources of Soviet capacity, Zhukov pointed to the combined effects of Soviet industry and Allied deliveries as essential. That is not to diminish domestic ingenuity or the sacrifices of Soviet workers. It is to recognize that industrial output plus logistics equals military effect. So return to the counterfactual. Germany seizes Moscow, Leningrad falls, the Caucasus yields oil. These are powerful gains. But do those gains mean the Reich wins the war? Here the narrative must split into scenarios, because the historical record resists single-line certainty. Scenario A, negotiated stalemate. By 1944-45, exhausted by attrition and with both sides suffering enormous casualties and economic dislocation, an equilibrium of sorts could appear. Germany controls the Western Soviet territories, including the Caucasus and key cities. The Soviet Union holds the vast eastern interior and retains much of its industrial base. A bitter, fragile peace under prolonged armistice might be negotiated, perhaps enforced by exhaustion rather than decisive battlefield collapse on either side. Europe would be carved into spheres of influence in a settlement less favorable to the Allies than in our timeline, and the wartime map would be fundamentally altered. But this peace would be uneasy. The logistics of occupying and administering vast Russian territories, the persistence of partisan resistance, and the industrial recuperation possible in the East mean the settlement might not last. A temporary advantage could be reversed if the Soviets rebuilt, rearmed, and renewed offensive pressure with strategic patience. Scenario B is a protracted Soviet recovery and eventual victory, delayed and more costly. Even after Moscow or the Caucasus fell, Soviet industrial relocation and the sheer scale of production could, with continued lend-lease and political mobilization, produce the materiel for a counteroffensive. This is the war of attrition outcome. Germany gains territory but cannot convert that into sustainable strategic dominance because the Soviet Union can replace losses, heal its transport network, and eventually project another offensive, perhaps pushing back by 1946 or 1947. The cost in human life and physical destruction would be far higher than in our timeline. Cities, countryside, and civilian populations would endure extended hardship. Importantly, this outcome is not guaranteed. It depends on continued Allied support, the resilience of Soviet production, and the capacity to field trained personnel to crew the machines the factories produce. Both scenarios share a core truth. Whether through temporary bargaining leverage or delayed collapse, the war's trajectory depended far more on machines, fuel, transport, and industrial throughput than on the weather alone. The winter may have been the dramatic, photogenic adversary, frozen bodies, iced-up artillery, frostbitten fingers, but it was not the decisive mechanism that determined whether Germany could turn battlefield success into strategic victory. That mechanism was economics in motion, the ability to produce at scale, to supply at pace, and to move the output to where it mattered. This is not to dismiss how damaging winter conditions were. Cold, immobilized vehicles, reduced air operations, and sapped morale. Logistics groaned under winter storms. Roads became quagmires or rivers froze in treacherous ways. Tactical plans foundered when equipment failed or when units starved for replacements. But call winter a symptom rather than the disease. The disease was an industrial and logistical mismatch. German operational reach expanded faster than Germany's capacity to sustain that reach across the geography of the Soviet Union. The Red Army's answer, moving entire factories and populations east, industrializing under extremity, and integrating Allied supplies, plugged the gap between production and frontline firepower. Consider one emblematic statistic. Roughly 427,284 trucks entered the Soviet arsenal through Lend-Lease. Each of those trucks was less an artifact than a multiplier. They kept artillery supplied, hauled fuel to tank columns, evacuated wounded, and transported engineers to mend bridges. Without them, Soviet factory output might have remained high on paper but low in battlefield effect. The 14,000 aircraft provided by the Allies and the 4.5 million tons of food kept the industrial base and armies alive and flyable. It is no accident that numerically by 1942, Soviet tanks and aircraft outpaced German production, but it was the logistics that allowed those numbers to matter where it counted. Let us be explicit about probabilities. Had Germany concentrated the extra 20–30% of combat power on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht would very likely have seized major urban centers and resource regions earlier, and with greater effect. The probability of a German-controlled Western Russia and temporary seizure of the Caucasus would increase significantly under those conditions. But converting territorial gains into a long-term political settlement favorable to Berlin would depend on Germany's ability to govern, supply, and defend these newly acquired regions, and on the Soviet Union being unable to rebuild at scale. Given the documented pace of Soviet industrial relocation and the scale of Allied assistance, both of which are historically attested, the likelihood that Germany could achieve a permanent, stable victory without further escalation or new allies is far from certain. In other words, winter could arrest a campaign in the short run, but in the medium to long run, it was production and supply that determined whether armies could keep fighting, recover, and turn numbers into strategic outcomes. We must also recognize the human cost embedded in either prolonged scenario. A negotiated stalemate implies continued suffering under occupation, forced labor, and the disruption of millions. A delayed Soviet victory implies years more of fighting, tens of millions more affected, and cities flattened in protracted campaigns. The arithmetic of war is not merely abstract. Each ton of fuel, each spare part, each locomotive is tied to human survival or death. Any counterfactual that imagines a different territorial map must also reckon with the moral and human consequences of prolonged conflict on an even vaster scale. So why does the winter story persist in popular memory? Because weather gives us a clear villain to point at, a condition that is external, visible, and poetic. It offers an image: men halted by frost, tanks freezing solid, plans derailed by ice. But history does not yield its causation to a single image. The Eastern Front was decided by a web of interacting factors: operational choices, initial deployments, industrial capacity, international aid, and logistics. The winter mattered. It shaped battles and inflicted suffering. But it was not the decisive arbiter. What mattered more was whether a belligerent could produce the instruments of war and sustain them in motion across vast spaces. A final thought. If Lend-Lease had not existed or had been drastically reduced, the plausibility of Soviet victory in the same time frame diminishes markedly. Without nearly 500,000 trucks and tens of thousands of aircraft, Soviet production could have remained just production. Machines without routes to reach the front. Factories running without the fuel or parts to keep outputs operational. Zhukov's practical acknowledgement of Allied aid underscores this point. Soviet capacity without Allied logistics would have been weaker in converting factories into frontline power. That does not mean an automatic German triumph. Rather, it means the timeline, the costs, and the balance of probabilities would shift significantly. So where does that leave our opening image? The frozen infantry 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. It remains haunting and instructive. It captures the human scale of cold, exhaustion, and proximity to a strategic objective. But to stop there is to mistake a symptom for the bottleneck. The decisive questions are economic and logistical. Could Germany have sustained an offensive, occupied and administered territories, and overcome a relocated and well-supplied Soviet industry? Or would stretched supply lines, partisan warfare, and the sheer continental-scale force a different outcome? Those are the realities that made the Eastern Front a test of industrial capacity, more than a contest decided by thermometers. Which brings us back to the core claim. The Russian winter delivered drama, but the decisive mechanisms of victory and defeat on the Eastern Front were production, fuel, transport, and the ability to turn factories into functioning fighting forces. That is where logistics becomes history. That is where trucks, rails, and machine tools meet strategy. Drop your answer in the comments. Could the USSR have won without American Lend-Lease? And if you want more deep dives that stitch together battlefield drama with the economics that actually decide wars, subscribe and stick around for the next episode.